So with the United States looking like it's about to go rogue in terms of diplomatic relations, we've had the spat, very open confrontation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky in the last few days. Can Europe step in to fill the void that a potential American exit from supporting Ukraine might reveal? So I'm going to read out a tweet from Donald Tusk. I'll put it up on the screen. It's not Donald Trump this time making a statement, but Donald Tusk. He is the Prime Minister of Poland, and Poland is the big, I would say, regional power next to Ukraine, other than obviously Russia, as it has a growing economy. It's still obviously less than you're going to see in big Western European countries like France, Germany, the UK, or say the US, obviously, but it is growing quite quickly, and they are building their military quite quickly. Under the Tusk government, they plan to spend between 4 and 5% of GDP on defense, national defense this year, Poland. So they definitely are becoming the leaders, and certainly the pro-Ukrainian leaders in the region, and maybe all of Europe. So Donald Tusk said this morning, enough talking, it's time to act. Let's finance our aid for Ukraine from the Russian frozen assets. He also said, number two, let's strengthen air policing, the Baltic Sentry, and the EU borders with Russia. And number three, let's swiftly adopt new fiscal rules to finance the EU security and defense, right? So the last point there, he's referring to having a collective defense outside of NATO, because now we don't know what the security guarantees in reality might turn out to be from the United States if, for example, Russia were to attack one of the three Baltic states, maybe Finland, maybe it could be Poland itself. That is unclear. I'm not saying that the US won't come to their aid or that Russia would launch an attack right now, a more obvious attack to test Article 5 of NATO. Article 5 of NATO is the common defense clause to the NATO treaty that has been very effective. It's only ever been invoked once. That was actually by the United States after 9/11. Number two, let's strengthen air policing. That makes a lot of sense. Russia has been creating a lot of provocations, especially in the Baltic Sea. A lot of the cables that connect the different infrastructure on the seabed have been damaged rather suddenly in the last few months. So there's suspected arson in that sense. So along with other provocations, for example, buzzing, I think is the word, for Russian air defense of, say, NATO planes or NATO member state planes in the Baltic Sea, even targeting a French plane. And that is like a very low level provocation compared to obviously an invasion or an actual direct attack. But the main point, number one, is seizing the Russian frozen assets. Now, you might remember that Russia and Vladimir Putin were not super smart in how they thought strategically about the Russian economy at the beginning of the 2022 invasion, because they left a lot of money in Western financial institutions. So there's an estimate about 300 billion-ish, you could say dollars or euros, they're pretty close in terms of the exchange rate at the moment. And they were left primarily in financial institutions in the European Union. There's about 250 billion euros approximately that is there, and they have been frozen. And in fact, the interest accruing on those deposits is being currently used to assist Ukraine, but not the principal. The principal has been left there and it has been frozen. Russia can't touch it. So as you see, most of that money, I think some of it, maybe there's an extra 20 billion or something in British financial institutions, but basically in Europe, most of that money has been held. We can just make a round figure of 250 billion. And that would obviously go a long way in terms of supporting Ukraine. If we look at the total aid that they have received so far, in spite of what Donald Trump tries to claim with these 300 billion in the video I had yesterday, in fact, it's probably close to 100 billion that the US has provided in financial and military support to Ukraine, and the European Union and the other European allies together have provided something similar. They've been providing a lot more financial aid than military aid. So that would go a long way to financing Ukraine's needs going forward. That would come from Russia's money, ironically. Now, there are a few issues with that. One, it would create a credibility problem potentially, that why would other countries put their money in the European Union financial institutions in the future if they could be seized? However, this is a pretty extreme example where Russia has not only invaded their neighbors, they're actually basically a threat to the European continent, because they may next decide if they are in any way successful in Ukraine to invade a NATO state. Could be the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, or Poland, or somewhere else on the continent. And in fact, there is in reality an undeclared war by Russia against the rest of Europe at this point. And that isn't in Russia's camp. We basically have a new Cold War. I went down to Narva. You can see the live stream from a few weeks ago where I stood looking into Russia across the river Narva. You can see the iconic bridge with the Russian fortress on the other side in Ivangorod, and then the Herman Castle on the Estonian side. So in those circumstances, it might be the best course of action to take those risks now in terms of seizing the assets to fund Ukraine, especially if the US is potentially going to stop providing assistance to Ukraine. It would definitely compensate for the shortfall financially, and then they can buy weapons and provide aid, financial aid to Ukraine with that Russian money. Of course, then that Russian money wouldn't be available for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Potentially, Russia has caused with its illegal invasions of Ukraine quite a lot of damage. It would be well in excess of 300 billion, most likely. It may even be up to 1 trillion by the end. Who knows when this war actually ends and how much damage is caused and how much compensation, in principle, Russia should owe Ukraine. And that money then, since it's already been given, wouldn't be available for the reconstruction effort. However, with such a crisis, with Donald Trump's apparent 180 in terms of U.S. foreign policy, it's gone from supporting Ukraine to very clearly having a Russia-friendly approach. They're basically negotiating with Russia without Ukraine, which would be the equivalent of Ukraine negotiating with China about ending the war with Russia. And maybe that's something that we're going to see going forward, actually, is Ukraine going to maybe have to pivot a little bit towards China. That's a pretty difficult assessment to make. But I think maybe Europe will also have to think about maybe having to pivot slightly towards China to balance an increasingly hostile U.S. if that comes to pass. And of course, Donald Trump is notorious for flip-flopping, so maybe in a week he's suddenly going to be back to bashing Putin as he was 3 weeks ago, and suddenly pro-European again. I don't have much optimism for that happening, although it is a possibility. So this 300 billion is kind of the Trump card that can be played at this point. It would be good to seize it now before the U.S. negotiations with Russia go further in a pro-Russian direction. It would also, just the threat of doing it now would make both Russia and the U.S. maybe take a pause for thought. We've had the mineral agreement that the U.S. would propose to Zelensky. They basically gave him a contract to give away for basically nothing additional, if we're to believe what was written in the contract, for 50% of all Ukraine's mineral wealth. And now that is being apparently renegotiated, i.e. since it was rejected, the US will now bring their demand down, presumably, and offer something new. But all this, even just the threat of it at this point, would help Zelensky's bargaining position, because being cut off from US aid is going to cause a massive problem for Ukraine in its resistance to Russian aggression. Not only would there no longer be more aid coming, then you're going to run out of some crucial weapon systems eventually, like Patriot missiles to shoot down Russian rockets, also HIMARS. Also, Ukraine relies to a certain extent on US intelligence to identify Russian military targets, so they may be left more blind. Plus, you got the Starlink, which is obviously a company owned by Elon Musk, who is extremely close to President Donald Trump. So they do need some sort of plan. This is the obvious thing to do at this point. One could say that we are rapidly approaching maybe even an existential threat to the European Union and overall security on the European continent if Ukraine cannot be sustained in its defense against Russian aggression. Any sort of bad peace deal that basically rewards Vladimir Putin for his aggression would set a very bad precedent and potentially free up his troops, that is, battle-hardened troops, to then redeploy somewhere else on the continent and threaten another country. I'll leave it at that for this video. Down below, I have some links. I have a guide if you are planning to go to Ukraine that will help you in terms of staying as safe as possible. The obvious caveat that it is a country at war, the biggest war in Europe since World War II. And also let me know how you like this content, and if you would prefer I just do one long daily video, for example, where I put several stories together. I am filming inside and making regular videos now, or you just want me to approach just one topic in a little bit more depth in a video. So with that, I will say, as you can see, I have a little bit of Odessan humor, Odetski humor on my t-shirt. Slava Ukraini, do peremоги.